Calling at the Trobriands. Nisan was a primitive sort of place. If the Great Depression lasts much longer, it will become even more primitive. It could easily revert to its pre-civilized days, a scrapping of missionary medallions, a discard of lap-laps, an end to the head tax, and Nisan in 10 years would be about where it began. There is a white trader there, a determined man holding grimly to the last of the great plantation from which he tried desperately to wrest something of a living. Much of his hard-done work is now abandoned, for the poor price of copra on world markets does not make its cultivation worthwhile. Like so many planters in the South Seas in these days, particularly in the British South Seas, where their plight seems to have been overlooked, he was just hanging on. He was a soldier, a fine, upstanding man, hard-working, lean, tanned. He had one eye, the other being somewhere in France, and he walked with a slight limp. I liked the trader. The traditional picture of the gin-soaked South Seas trader may have been true once of a type of man in the less important islands, but it is a gross and foul libel on the traders of today. They live no lives of indolent ease, with grass-skirted maids to wait on them, while the palms grow, and the coconuts fall on the ground, and the copra somehow climbs out and dries itself. The grass-skirted maids have scruff on their breasts, and many of them are venereal. The copra, even if it made itself, would yield little profit, and any man whose task it is in life to control Melanesian labor in an island under League of Nations mandate had better forget there ever was a lotus tree, for he will never eat of its fruit, neither its fruit nor any other that he has not tenfold earned. From daylight until dark the Nisan trader worked, superintending the gathering of the fallen coconuts and the drying of the copra, the upkeep of the property, the health and the work of his 40 boys. Every male native who can walk is a boy until he dies, getting their food for them from his stock and from the lagoon. Twice a year the district officer put in on his tour of inspection to see that the labor was properly treated, and that no one had been spanked. The trader had not once been off the island in 16 years. In all that time we were the second strangers to put in. He was alone, and preferred to remain so rather than to be one of a small white community into whose joint interests, pastimes, shams, bridge parties, and quarrels he would be forced. It is better to rely on oneself for company than upon the inevitably doubtful qualities of a mixed mob. How long would he stay there? He did not know when he could get away, if ever. The plantation now was all he had after those many years, and he had to hold grimly on to that. The civilized policy that played so great a part in opening up the South Seas, of getting the producer in the middleman's debt, keeping him there, and profiting by his product, has grown so well that though intended originally for the natives, it now embraces most of the whites. The producers of copra, if there is ever again any profit in their commodity, are for the most part so deep in debt that they will produce for years only to satisfy their creditors. Many of them, realizing this, have long since given up the hopeless struggle. On island after island I have seen the plantations abandoned, and going back quickly to the original bush, to the stolid native who always could find what he needed in his islands. The ways of the white have indeed been incomprehensible. All the natives at Nassau are Catholics, as medallions strung about their dirty necks testify. There was but one dissenter, a Methodist named Caraki Joe, houseboy to the trader. Caraki was from New Ireland. The natives had but a vague idea of the essential differences between the manners in which they were supposed to worship God, and there was peace in the land. There were no theological arguments, and there was not very much worship either. They looked forward to the visits of the missionaries because the missionaries were nice fellows and gave them things, and so far as I could see, this was about as deeply as their religion went. They took life as it came, and were not bothered much with any conception of the hereafter. Their ideas of heaven as a place high up in the sky had recently suffered a rude shock, since one of their number had been recruited to work at the buffalo fields in New Guinea. He was taken there by airplane and kept a sharp lookout during his journey through the sky. In utter disgust, he reported on his return that the white fellow had been telling lies. Heaven? There wasn't any heaven up there, only sky he had seen. If some missionary did not put in an appearance soon after my departure to reply to the logic of this man who had been there, the natives of Nassau by now are probably digging into their coral in a vain search for hell, and if they do not find that, their conception of Christianity will vanish entirely. What, no hell, no heaven? They cannot conceive of these ideas in the abstract. The notion of a heaven-bound soul had slight appeal to them. Whatever good comes to them, they want their bodies to be there with them to enjoy it, and they like the idea of the living bodies of their enemies. And of the socially inferior frizzling in hell, prodded by the forks of the demons. Religion without hell, I fear, would lose much of its attraction to them. Well, we told them about it. They are a quiet lot, the dwellers of Nassau, in these dull days, though a mild old man who came aboard was pointed to with pride as a murderer. He sat on his haunches in a dugout canoe with which two children paddled. He had a very old felt hat and an older clay pipe, of both of which he made the utmost use. He did not look to me very much like a murderer. He had killed a trader in the old days, they said, a German trader. It was a queer yarn. The trouble on Nassau has usually been concerned with women, of whom there are not enough to go round. They just don't get born, the trader said. Competition for the hands of the fair then is hard. The young bloods in former days often indulged in daring competitions, doing full things to show their manhood, and the one who dared the most or did the biggest full thing won the girl. The sure way to oust a rival was to think of some daring act which he could not imitate or surpass. This noble old fellow, being above the usual intelligence, hit on an idea of murdering the trader. There was, he reasoned, only one white trader. If he hit him with an axe and exhibited the remains, why, the day was his. The nearest trader was on Bougainville. So he killed the trader and thus won his bride, and was happily married, I hope, and lived peacefully ever after. His kinsfolk, however, did not live so happily, for in the course of time the Germans heard of the murder and sent a punitive expedition to impress upon the natives the impropriety of such behavior. They did this in the usual manner by burning a few villages and reducing the population, but they missed the murderer. This was years ago, before the war. Now he came often and sat about happily in the sun, and no one seemed to bear him any grudge. His record in daring, I gathered, stands unrivaled to this day. I saw some elephantitis, loathsome disease, skin complaints were common, scabby legs, scurfy skin, ulcerated shoulders. Each village had its medicine boy, who, so far as I could gather, had at some time been appointed by the government and given a brief, rough training. At the time of my visit, the district officer was long overdue, and no medicines were left. In the picturesque but slightly improper words of the medicine boy of Pokonin, all fella messin, bugger up, finish. Catch 'em more government by Mimby. I hope he did, but there was need of it. I went out from Nisan early one morning under power in a flat calm. I should have been a long time trying to sail, or to kedge out through that entrance. On the lagoon, as we departed, a tall native with elephantine feet and a flower in his limbed hair chanted a weird dirge. A huge stingray, touched by our keel, darted angrily out of the way. A dog barked on the foreshore, and the bird Oscar, which I had set free here, stood watching us go. There had been no keeping Oscar on board once he heard the other birds and smelled the land. I took him ashore and let him go, hoping that his wings, which we had lightly cut to save him from flying overboard at sea and being drowned, would quickly grow. Poor Oscar had become so accustomed to a life without danger that he paid no attention even to dogs. I feared he would quickly reach some native spot, and this he probably did as soon as we were out of sight. But he was still there when we left. We could recognize him by the white paint he had smeared from the bulwarks on his tail. I left Nisan, bound towards Tulagi in the Solomons, port of entry in those parts. We were getting short of water and also needed a few stores. We had done quite well for fresh provisions at the lagoon, and left with 5 pigs, 2 goats, 4 ducks, 12 fowls, and a good supply of lemons, oranges, coconuts, pawpaw, bananas, limes, nuts, yams, and taro. At the anchorage we were plentifully supplied with fruits and fish and crabs. The limes, lemons, and oranges were of very good quality and had, I think, been introduced by the Germans, who also had brought the ducks. Nisan was uncommonly well stocked with pigs. For the first 4 days after leaving Nisan it was calm, and there was a current setting us to the west. I shut off the power as soon as we were clear of the lagoon, reserving it for difficult channels of that kind. We were set steadily towards New Ireland. On clear days we could see land all round us, Feni, Tonga, New Ireland, Bucca, and Bougainville, all of which are included in the mandated territory. They were interesting, and I wish we could have visited all of them. But we were now almost 3 months out from Singapore, and I pressed on. Or I should say, I tried to press on. Then the southeast trade came, fresh with a considerable sea, and the set against us was stronger than ever. At that time of the year, the transition period between the 2 seasons, the southeast and the northwest, we should have had a reasonable proportion of usable winds. If the southeast trade had blown from the south, I could have gone to the east on the starboard tack. If it came from the east, I could have stood south on the port tack. Any wind from west or north was fair, but it never once blew from those directions. My course to reach Tulagi was roughly towards the southeast, and from there the wind came. It blew a moderate gale twice. I had my trade wind sails aloft, and which had then been subjected to the hard wear of many tropic days and hot sun and rain. They began to go. I could not hold sail. My royals split, and then the topgallants. The head sails went. The courses were good, and they stood, but shortly the fore and main topsails, the most important sails in the ship, also began to show bad signs of wear. Whenever possible, we clewed the sails up aloft and sewed them as they were bent. When this was not possible, we sent them down, repaired them, and bent them again. I had a full Cape Horn suit in the sail locker, but I did not want to bring this out. It would suffer unnecessary wear in those regions and would be spoiled for the stormy west winds where it would be needed. So I did what I could with the old sails and kept on. It became dispiriting for a while. The delights of tropic sailing are all very well in an amply powered schooner, running before a fair wind to go westwards over the Pacific before the trade can be enjoyable, but to try to beat a full-rigged ship eastwards against the trade is no joy at all. All one's ideas of the idyllic tropics, if one still has any, mine had vanished almost with my boyhood, must be scrapped. Getting to windward becomes a desperate, long-continued fight, with the odds heavily against one. Even had I wished to use the engine, and I could not get over my curious idea that this was a kind of sacrilege, it was of little benefit. The thing had generated 50 horsepower when it was built in 1916. Many of those horses were dead now, but if they had all lived and had turned 100 more with them, they could not have pushed the ship, with her big rigging against wind and sea. Nor was it much use to beat with sails and engine, for she would not point higher than 6 points in a sea, and the yards hauled sharp on the backstays caused so much chaff that the sails and the rigging would quickly go to pieces. No, we had to sail. Well, that was what we were there for. The current now pushed me far to the westward of the Trobriand Islands, near which we then were, and over amongst the uninhabited Lusandques. I determined to put in here, if I could, and get to anchor down while we thoroughly overhauled the sails. We could not spare the topsail from the yards while we tried to beat, without losing hopelessly. If we were driven much further down to leeward, we should be in an awkward situation, and might have to wait for the coming of the northwest season to free ourselves. There was no fault in the ship, which was as good as ever, and for a full-rigged ship she worked to windward very well, but the conditions were too much for her short lengths in the troubled calms that the strong trade left. She bucked and rolled and flung her broad bows into the swell, and went bodily to leeward and backward. It was my fault for being there. I ought to have stayed in the counter-equatorial current of the North Pacific until I was to windward of all the Solomons, before standing down across the line. However, there I was, and something had to be done about it. It freshened up, and I stood towards the Lusandques on the port tack, making about south-southwest with the drift and the leeway. The Lusandques are poorly charted, and as far as I could see, little would be gained by surveying them, for ships are well advised to stay away. We stood several times almost to the edge of the great reef that surrounds them. They are a group of cays on a shallow coral bed of considerable extent off the northeast coast of New Guinea. Beyond them there is nothing but reefs and the d'Entrecasteaux Islands to New Guinea. I could see no anchorage. I could find no entrance into this vast lagoon, and if I had found one, would have been most careful about using it. It did not look the kind of place in which a full-rigged ship would be safe, and the weather was such that I dared not send out a boat to investigate. Our dinghy was suffering from 17 broken ribs from its battering in the sea at Nasan. Beside that, I had only a Norwegian pram and the ship's lifeboats. The pram was very small, and I could not spare a crew for a lifeboat. The sails became worse, in spite of all our efforts to take care of them. The wind was no better. I beat and mostly lost. After beating for 2 days and covering, by the log, more than 400 miles, we found we had lost 5. We came in on the Lusanques to leeward of the place where we had been 2 days before. Nowhere was their anchorage. I computed from a series of accurate observations that the set towards the northwest, direct against me, was at the rate of from 40 to 60 miles a day. This was serious. I decided to go into Kiriwina in the Trobriands if I could. Here there was anchorage, and here I could procure refreshments too, though I was not in need of these. I still had fresh water sufficient to take me to Tulagi, but how was I to get to the Trobriands? I was within sight of Kiriwina, then to leeward of it. I beat on. I did not have to regain much of the lost ground in order to enter the channel between Kiriwina and the smaller island of Kalewina, which with Kitava form the Trobriand island group. There was I, read in the directions, an assistant resident magistrate at Lozwia on Kiriwina. That was good. I could go and see him as I had seen the commandant at Bongao. It was scarcely probable that Lozwia would be a port of entry, but at any rate there was someone to report the ship to. Round northern Australian waters there have been in recent years many scares of strange vessels, usually said to be of the sampan type, which raid Trocas beds and bêche de mer on the local reefs. I did not wish to be confused with these marauders. I wanted no Trocas or bêche de mer, and though my vessel was decidedly no sampan, she was certainly a strange craft to be in those seas. I did not wish to be mistaken again for a mysterious vessel, probably engaged in nefarious practices. I suppose the charge would have been either that I was blackbirding or bound with a cargo of coolies to work for the Italians in northern Queensland. I was nothing but an honest citizen with a ship making a difficult voyage, and I did not want there to be any mistakes about it. So I headed when I could towards the passage between Kiriwina and Kalewina to Loswia. It proved rather difficult to get there. In the end I had to come in by night after beating for 10 days. I did not care for this night piloting, since there are no lights in those waters, and they are very poorly charted, but I knew I should either go in then when I had the chance or not at all. By that time we had a regular routine for such difficult work, and every man had his post. There were 6 leadsmen, 1 in the forechains on each side, another aft, and 3 at the patent deep-sea apparatus, which sounded to 300 meters but had to be worked by hand. The carpenter was at the windlass, the mate with his maul on the forecastle head by the starboard anchor, the second mate aft, and there was a picked helmsman. Everything was ready to fetch the ship up at a minute's notice. I would have sent a boat ahead to sound if I had had one. It has to be like that when you are wandering through coral reefs. They rise up quickly. There is scant warning. I knew from the chart that the wide bay on the western side of Kiriwina, where Loswia is situated, was full of reefs, though the channel between the islands was shown to be tolerably clear. But how is one to preserve a bearing in a dangerous channel, when it is dark and there is nothing on which to get a bearing? There are fast tides, swift streams, which more often than not set across the channels instead of directly through them. Almost anywhere a sudden outcrop of coral may grate on the keel. Coral is hard. I usually conned from the 4 cross trees by day, with the sun behind me, since I could better gauge the depth of the water by its changing colors from there, and see the dangers. But at night all water is the same, unless it breaks. I went then out to the jib boom end, about 30 feet before the vessel, fairly high. In this manner we at last approached the channel into Lozwia early on the evening of October 13th, 1935, when the ship was almost a year out of England. I held my breath. The wind for once was fair, barely fair. We could just hold the course. The moon should have risen early. It did, but it was so cloudy that its rising made hardly any difference. I could not see. I went on in, groping. The channel was narrow. The land was close. I could hear the wind in the trees, hear the natives talking and laughing. I saw a village fire. I had only the fore and main topsails set, the staysails, and the spanker. No bottom, chant the leadsman, no bottom. The chart, long since committed to memory, gives nothing but confusing depths of no bottom at 8 and 20 fathoms. Here and there we sounded continually, with the deep sea lead to 60, 80, and 100 meters, and came right through the channel with no bottom. The forward leadsman swung hand leads on 25 fathoms. No bottom. The chant is worrying as we stand on. I hear the water lapping on the reefs. A dog barks. Shall we come through and into that reef-filled bay without finding anchorage? I want to get the anchor down now as soon as there are soundings. I will take no more chances, but we get no bottom. No bottom. I cannot drop the anchor in the sea. I clew up the fore topsail, take the main from her. Her way seems prodigious on this quiet night. There must be anchorage. I am worried, very worried, for I know how precipitately these reefs rise. When you are in soundings, you are aground. When we have almost reached Bully Point, the deep sea lead suddenly has a reading 40 meters. Up and down it goes. Its gear aft, 37 meters, 12 meters. The hand leads have bottom at 7. Hard a starboard. Into the wind with her. Let go. Let go it is. The cable roars. In the quiet night she brings up nicely. The torn sails are furled at last, and the yards are trimmed. The riding lights go up, and we have arrived. I put out the dinghy, as was my practice, and sounded round. The moon was clear then, almost full. We had to pull a very little way from the ship to get on a reef, but there was room enough. She was all right, leaving a watchman on deck. All hands turned in for a good night's sleep. In the morning, examining the place from the masthead, I saw that we had chanced on the best anchorage, so I stayed there ahead of us. The wide bay between the horns of Bulawayo and the wooded southern end of Kiriwina seemed full of reef of that same nasty pale green tint which had distinguished the Lusunkes. It was a locality best left alone. Perhaps there was a channel through to the south. I could not see one. And did not look any closer. We could go out the way we came in. We were rather close to the fringing reef of Waiwoaya. Half a cable from the ship, there were 2 fathoms. I liked the appearance of the island. It is coral surrounded by fringing reefs. The tops of the trees seem to be about 300 feet above sea level. The land, such as I could see of it, appeared fertile and well planted. There were numerous villages of dome-like grass houses, some of them along the shore, and others inland, all of them appearing from the masthead very orderly, neat, and well laid out. I could see many gardens, and the whole appearance of the island was such as I had not expected to see anywhere in the Pacific in these days. It seemed to be almost unspoiled. I could not see the government station from there. Several native canoes came out to us with yams, coconuts, fowls, and sweet potatoes. They also brought grass skirts to exchange for tobacco, but I was unfortunately without a supply of the stick tobacco they demanded. They brought paddles too, and one man had a model of a purling canoe for which he asked fib chillin. They knew some English here, though the horrid abortion of pigeon was not in general use. The natives were upstanding fellows, light-skinned, clean, well-built. They looked more Polynesian than Melanesian, and there was an entire absence of the morose scabbiness of Nisan. They were animated, cheerful, and welcoming. I did not allow them to come on board, but let them stand in the channels and sit along the hammock netting, from which vantage post they stared in wonder at our clean decks, and the cannon and the maze of lines. We began at once to unbend the torn sails and to set about repairing them. Almost the entire suit urgently needed overhauling. The natives looked on and chattered among themselves. I made no attempt to land. I wished only to use this refuge to repair the sails. The quiet peace of this gentle morning was rudely interrupted by the arrival of the official launch from Loswia, to set on board a fellow in white shorts with a close-clipped mustache, a sharp jaw, and coal-blue eyes. From this gentleman there was no welcome. He was, I gathered, the assistant resident magistrate, and it had gone to his head. Had we been to Saumarez? He asked. Saumarez? Where was that? I had a vague idea. The place was up some creek somewhere in the East Indies. No, I had not been to Saumarez. Had no intention of going. There. If we had not been to Saumarez, we could not remain at anchorage. It appeared that this was the port of entry for Papuan territory. It was the same old problem. If I could have gone to Saumarez, wherever it was, I would most certainly not have gone to Loswia. I pointed out to the magistrate that I had brought my ship into the waters of his domain only to find anchorage and repair the blown-out sails, and for no other purpose. I did not care especially about the Trobriand Islands, and desired no contact with the land. The anchorage we were in was the only one in those parts. I was there, and I was going to stay there until my ship was fit to take the seas again. He seemed to imagine that we could repair the sails in 5 minutes and be gone again. I told him it was 3 days' hard work at the very least. We would get it done as quickly as possible and then be gone. The magistrate was only carrying out the law. The Trobriands and Papuan territory, for which the ports of entry are Port Moresby and Saumarez. Saumarez lay some 100 miles away to the south, beyond a maze of reefs, which were not navigable by my vessel. But surely a sailing vessel properly accredited, and with her papers all in order, with a clean bill of health, and making a harmless voyage, might, if she can, find such haven as she needs. Often on that voyage I felt envious of Captain Cook, and Wallace, and Byron, and all those pioneers, though never of Carteret, for when they put into islands they were met only by spears and stones, never by tax gatherers, immigration inspectors, and assistant magistrates. Spears and stones may be placated by exhibitions of firm friendliness. The great cook excelled at such things, or met with their kind. But magistrates, they hold a mean advantage over us all. They are the law. They can make long reports about us, and charge us with every kind of misdemeanor, and bind us laboriously with red tape. The conduct of this Governor-General of the Trojans, though he was within his rights, contrasted strangely with the quiet common sense of the Filipino commandant at Bongal. A man with a really turbulent people to rule, and now and then a taste of warfare. He sent the islanders smartly about their business, and I saw that they seemed afraid of him, as well they might be for one who could jail them with a word. But he softened once in a while. The personal side of him, when it showed through, was quite the reverse of the official. I grew to like him as a man before we were gone, but as an official, as a ruling representative of the Great White at the Trojans, why, I frankly thought the whole place would be much better for his absence. The fact that he received us churlishly did not greatly affect my opinion. I was anchored, and I was going to repair my sails, but I saw in the very short time I was there that this Kiriwina, last of the happy islands of the South Sea, deserves a man of lofty ideals and experienced, far-seeing judgment, a paragon of administrative and formative excellence, a man grown old in the scientific survey of the Pacific and its peoples, an administrator, in short, capable of preserving this last vestige of paradise for the world. This little man had set out, I heard, to improve it, he and the missionaries. As soon as his back was turned, I saw another launch. It was a trader very drunk with a bottle of gin. He said he was the Bishop of Melanesia, though he looked to me like the Earl of Footscray, and he invited all hands ashore to his inn. He really had an inn, I discovered. He drank so much that he had to take out a license as a hotel to get his own supplies. I wish I had seen a great deal of Trojans. I liked immensely all I saw. I went ashore with the magistrate's permission. He wrote me frequent official epistles telling me to get out, but ashore he was all right. I discovered that something of his hostile reception was due to the fact that in former days Kiriwina had been the haunt of boozing young bloods from Samare in quest for sex. These gentlemen and others had brought venereal disease. The Trobriand Islanders, as the magistrate pointed out, have moral standards different from our own, and the maidens attach no special importance to the sex act beyond considering it, rightly enough, as a necessary natural function. In this they are encouraged by their age-old belief that copulation and conception have nothing to do with one another, children being the spirits of their ancestors who creep into the bodies of the women unknown to them while they bathe. A husband recruited to work on a distant plantation, though the Trobriand Islanders do not often go away and are not much recruited, might return after 2 years and look upon his spouse's newborn babe without the slightest trace of jealousy. She had bathed a little carelessly, perhaps. A married life based upon such ideas as this has many advantages. more particularly in an island where nothing is known either of the need for or the practice of birth control. But such beliefs make the natives easy victims to venereal disease. For years, Kiriwina was a blot even in the Pacific. Through this dreadful scourge, nothing but many years of determined medical effort and strict control could check the evil. Things are better now, but the evil is not entirely eradicated and probably never will be. I fully sympathize with the desire of the magistrate to keep the misery of venereal disease from the people as much as he could. I still had a few of my own young men not properly recovered, though they had been under treatment for months. I kept them on board. No one was allowed ashore after dark, and no one from the island came to the vessel. By the permission of the magistrate, the boys, in 2 parties, were enabled to see a little of the coastal village by Lozwia. Each party was ashore for a few hours only, and they saw no more of the Trobriands. Some of them told me afterwards that they were approached by old men who asked them if they would like to buy their daughters. Pretty girls too, and quite willing, but I had scared the young gentlemen thoroughly about disease, and had given them to understand that this was still a hotbed of it. So far as I know, there were no purchasers. I had talked plainly about the beastliness of wanton promiscuity, for which there is always a high price to pay, disease or no disease, but the fear of disease was a greater deterrent than any moral scruples. They had seen the young man who went home by way of the Singapore hospital. As for the superiority of our own moral ideas, compared with those of the Trobriand Islanders, I do not know so much about that. The Zwia itself, though I did not care for the sight of the prisoners toiling by the government pass, their wrongdoing was trifling, was a pleasant place surrounded by well-populated villages of people, of happy brown people who played cricket on the mission field and met us smiling on the little wharf. The boys and the men were dressed simply in pieces of twisted fiber, covering something of the crotch, made fast fore and aft on a string of twine, or sometimes with the pearl divers on an ancient army belt bought from a trader. They all had large mops of fuzzy hair in which red flowers had been thrust, and here and there a feather. Into the lobes of their ears they had spliced small rings. A few had them also in their noses. The girls and women, many of whom were pleasant to look upon, wore abbreviated grass skirts, which, as they walked, swung seductively on their rounded forms. Some of the men and women had their hair shaved and their bodies blackened with soot. These were in the morning. All of them were clean, muscular, well-built, and most attractive in appearance and behavior. To walk along the lagoon pass was entrancing, though the magistrate took care to send an armed policeman with us when we went. The blue-robed, dark-visaged constable, trailing his gun, seemed curiously out of place there, though the constabulary I met were good fellows. They did not seem to take their duties with regard to us very seriously. Whatever may have been their instructions, we found them cheerful guides. The way was through clean, pleasant villages, in a few of which I saw the horrible rusted sheet iron which has become so common in the islands, past well-kept gardens, swimming pools, pigs very fat and very contented, coconuts, bananas, pineapples, and frequently groups of sturdy natives carrying the produce of their fields, like the Balinese. In each village the people came out to welcome us as we passed, eager to make friends. They offered us papa, coconuts, lime sticks, gourds, and such things, and they appeared more eager to give than to sell. But I had nothing with me to give in exchange, and therefore did not accept their presents. Often on board on the broad lagoon, We saw the fast canoes of the islanders, sailing, coming and going from the nearer islands. The Trobrianders have always been great sailors. The manner in which they handled their big canoes was grand to see, and we cheered them as they passed. They were as interested in our big canoe as we were in theirs, and they always sailed close by. Some of the cadets tried once not to sail but to paddle a short distance in a canoe from a village near the southern end of the lagoon, where they could not master even the art of balancing the vessel and were quickly thrown into the water. In the Trobriand canoes, the outrigger is so short a distance from the hull that its balancing effect seems minimized, but the natives can handle their craft beautifully. Indeed, these Argonauts of the Western Pacific, as Professor Malinowski has well called them, are among the most skilled of native sailors. Until more recent years, they were accustomed to make long trading voyages in their larger canoes, covering many hundreds of miles. They still sometimes venture towards the nearer of the neighboring islands on trading voyages, though in these days such trading as is done is more often carried on in the white man's efficient but unlovely powered luggers. As we came out to sea under sail from the lagoon, a large native canoe came with us, and I sailed from Kirawina with an abiding impression of the grace of this able native craft, and its lithesome, cheery crew, naked and happy, smiling in the sun.